All right. Speak, Lord, for your servants are listening. Amen.
Amen.
So, last week we saw that David was engaging in marital infidelity while Joab was out fighting the Ammonites, also known as the sons of Ammon. And now we'll see how David's own son, Amnon, is and whether he lives up to his name, which means faithful. So we'll see how this works out. We're starting to get into the part of 2 Samuel that I wrote a paper on, that one paper that I got published a little while.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm starting to get to parts that I have a little bit of insight on from that as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of my professors from Crandall wrote a book on this particular section of 2 Samuel. So it's got some interesting insights as well. All right. So can I get you to read up to and including verse 6?
Okay. Now Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. And after a time, Amnon, David's son, loved her. And Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother. And Jonadab was a very crafty man, and he said to him, "O son of the king, why are you so haggard morning after morning? Will you not tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Jonadab said to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Let my sister Tamar come and give me bread to eat and prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat it from her hand.'" So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. And when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, "Please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat from her hand."
All right. So a bit of a reminder about Amnon. He is currently the eldest son, and so presumably first in line for the throne. And when I say currently, I mean he always has been. That's kind of how these things work, unless somebody older than you happens to die. So presumably he's going to be the next king. And so we see here that he has a friend who is David's nephew.
A cousin, I think, eh?
Yeah,
Wouldn't it
cousin.
be a cousin?
Yeah, it's his cousin, David's nephew.
Mhm.
And so the word friend can either mean, just a generic friend like one has, or it could be a specific office in the government. The king's friend would be like his advisor, the person who, is, just friendly to him and, talks to him about things. And so this is, I think, the position that Jesus is talking about when he says that he has called us friends. And so we can, in fact, pray and tell him, what's going on, what we think should be done. And of course, he is king, and so he, actually decides what to do. But, we are able to talk to him, listen to him, advise him in a certain sense, not as if he does not know what is happening, but. However, Jonadab is not going to make the greatest use of this position. We're in chapter 13. Well, we're up to verse 6 or so now. All right, so Nathan told David in the last chapter that trouble was going to come from his own house. And so we see here one of his sons has got some sort of problem brewing, and he seems to be being egged on by one of David's nephews. So things are not going well so far. And of course, the reason that Tamar is referred to as Absalom's sister is A, because this will be relevant later in the story, but also B, because they have different mothers. And so that's why Amnon is not just saying my sister, because they're half siblings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So can I get you to read on to verse 14?
Mm-hmm. Then David sent home to Tamar, saying, "Go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house where he was lying down. And she took dough and kneaded it and made cakes in his sight and baked the cakes. And she took the pan and emptied it out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, "Send out everyone from me." So everyone went out from him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the chamber that I may eat from your hand." And Tamar took the cakes she had made and brought them into the chamber to Amnon her brother. But when she brought them near him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come, lie with me, my sister." She answered him, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." But he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her.
So a grievous sin, one that would carry a huge penalty under the law. There is a question brought up as to whether Tamar is saying something that is actually true, or if she's just trying to buy time for herself. But perhaps it doesn't matter that much necessarily. Let's see.
Mm-hmm.
Can I get you to read up to verse 22?
And her brother Absalom said to her,
Oops,
"Has Amnon
you
your-"
skipped a paragraph.
What's that? Oh, did I skip something?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, 15, yeah. Then Amnon hated her with very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Get up, go." But she said to him, "No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. He called the young man who served him and said, "Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her." Now she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, for thus were the virgin daughters of the king dressed. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. And Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe that she wore. And she laid her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. And her brother Absalom said to her, "Has Amnon your brother been with you? Now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart." So Tamar lived a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. When King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar.
So we see a few things here. One is that this thing which happens to Amnon is, I think, the way of many sins, that we commit them and then afterwards we come to our senses and reject them. Not necessarily to say that, Amnon repented, but that, before we commit a sin, we think, oh, it will be so great when I do this. oh, I can't wait, you're thinking about it, you're justifying to yourself, you're thinking, oh, won't it be good? And then afterwards, immediately you're like, what have I just done? This was terrible. And that's not always the case, of course, but in many cases it is. And this is also to show that Amnon's love is not really love, but it was a very brief, self-serving thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we are sort of brought to question, what exactly is Absalom doing? What is his plan here? Because, he says, he is your brother, do not take this to heart, hold your peace. So some people suggest that he is already making some sort of plan to do something. And that's why he's saying this, that we're about to see that he waits for 2 whole years before he does anything. And so it's possible that any plan that he's making requires to not attract too much attention to himself. We'll see. That being said, one thing that we are about to see pretty clearly, in fact, so clearly that you can actually see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Septuagint. It's not in the regular Hebrew text, but it adds before verse 22, but he, that is David, would not punish his son Amnon because he loved him since he was his firstborn. So this is, a problem on David's part. David should have shown both love and discipline, but it becomes sort of a running theme, if we haven't seen it already, that David is not the greatest family man. He has a habit of not really disciplining his children or giving them a whole lot of guidance. And it becomes perhaps an ongoing theme throughout the entire list of kings, that it is very rare for there to be a good king who then also has good children. So we are perhaps invited to consider how important it is to give good attention to raising children in the Lord. All right. Can I get you to read to verse 29?
Mm-hmm. After 2 full years, Absalom had sheep shearers at Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. And Absalom came to the king and said, behold, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. But the king said to Absalom, no, my son, let us not all go, lest we be burdensome to you. He pressed him, but he would not go, but gave him his blessing. Then Absalom said, if not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. And the king said to him, why should he go with you? But Absalom pressed him until he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Then Absalom commanded his servants, mark when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not fear, have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled.
So Absalom waits for 2 full years, which I keep mentioning, although we don't really see this much until the Book of Kings, but 2 years is generally the amount of time that an ended dynasty lasts. In this case, of course, David still has other sons, but this is the end of his firstborn. So they're going to have a festival here for sheep shearing. My professor, Dr. Bodner, notes that a common theme whenever there's some sort of party that involves sheep shearing is that somebody gets fleeced. In this case, it is Amnon, but in a previous example, it involved a different woman named Tamar. This was Judah and his daughter-in-law, who wanted to ensure that she would have sons.
Mhm.
And so we can kind of see there that Tamar becomes a family name within Judah, it appears.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, Absalom appears to the phrase here sounds very reminiscent of the beginning of Joshua. Do not fear, have I not commanded you? Be courageous and valiant.
Mm.
In Joshua 1:9, it's have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. So I don't know exactly what to say about that, aside from the fact that he seems to be taking matters into his own hands, so to speak.
Mhm.
Yes. So the sheep shearing festival, I kind of mentioned, what generally happens in the Bible, but generally the idea is that it's a festival at a specific time of the year where you shear sheep and apparently drink a non-zero amount of wine, it appears. And so this is not a religious festival, but it is a festival that exists within the general calendar of ancient Israel.
Mhm.
All right. Can I get you to read up to 33?
Mhm. Okay. While they were on the way, news came to David. Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. Then the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the earth. And all his servants who were standing by tore their garments. But Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, said, Let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead. For by the command of Absalom, this has been determined from the day he violated his sister Tamar. Now, therefore, let not my lord the king so take it to heart as to suppose that all the king's sons are dead, for Amnon alone is dead.
All right. So this is incredibly suspicious.
Yeah.
Like, why does he know this?
Yeah.
And so it raises some questions. It's not entirely clear what questions we're supposed to be asking. Well, no, I guess there is only one. How does he know what is going on here? So there are a few possibilities. One is that Jonadab is just trying to attach himself to whichever son of David he thinks is going to become the next king. And so he gets involved with their plots, no matter who they are. Another, and perhaps more disturbing possibility, is that Jonadab has not changed sides the entire time. That somehow this entire thing, from the beginning of the chapter until now, has all been Absalom's plan from the very beginning. And we're not going to be told what the answer to this question is. We're not going to see Jonadab very much more after this. I think only like once or twice and only very briefly.
Isn't there another possibility?
I suppose there is.
That one being that he was at the festival too, and he was one of the guys who fled?
Well, no, because it seems that it's too soon for very accurate news to have arrived. Like it seems that this is at the same time that David is hearing news that like all of your sons are dead.
Yeah.
And
so where did that come from? Who gave that news?
I don't know. Rumors travel very quickly, it appears. Well, I guess that is the question. How does a rumor like this travel faster than the truth? You'd think that the king's sons would be, the main
Yeah.
bearers of this news. So how do you get confused about that? I mean, perhaps the answer is as simple as every single person has a different theory about which of David's sons gets killed. And so by the time it gets to David, they're just telling him that they're all dead.
Yeah.
But I suppose it is technically possible that Jonadab was in fact at the festival. Although that kind of does bring us back to the original set of questions, which is why was he advising one brother and now another? But that is going to be a question that Absalom at least wants us to ask, which is, or maybe Absalom doesn't want us to ask, which is everything that Absalom has done and is going to do going forwards. Is this some sort of quest for justice on his part? Or is this all some sort of political scheme? I think eventually the answer to that question will be pretty clear, but for now, it seems that he's got a bit of a political campaign, if you will. And so far, his political campaign has been, my older brother deserved to die, and also he's dead, so you can't elect him.
Mm-hmm.
And so that puts me second in line for the throne. And Kiliab who? Never mentioned again. Don't know who that is. Maybe he died young. We don't know. And so presumably that now puts Absalom first in line for the throne. Now there's only that minor political hurdle of being a murderer who's about to flee to Geshur, but maybe he'll be able to worm his way out of that. Can I get you to read until the end of the chapter?
Okay. Okay. But Absalom fled, and the young man who kept the watch lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, many people were coming from the road behind him by the side of the mountain. And Jonadab said to the king, behold, the king's sons have come, as your servant said, so it has come about. And as soon as he had finished speaking, behold, the king's sons came and lifted up their voice and wept. And the king also and all his servants wept very bitterly. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son day after day. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur, and was there 3 years. And the spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom, because he was comforted about Amnon, since he was dead.
All right. So it appears that the theory that Jonadab is coming back from the festival is less likely given this part, where the king's sons arrive after Jonadab, and Jonadab says, see, what did I tell you? Although I suppose it's technically possible that he came back very quickly. Yes, Absalom is fleeing to Geshur. Now, this is not just some random country that he's chosen. He's going to live with his grandfather because his mother is Maacah of Geshur, who was one of the princesses of Geshur, to whom David made a marriage alliance. So they've got a marriage alliance, but Absalom is hoping that they don't have an extradition treaty, I guess. All right, so one more thought before we move on from this chapter is that there is a lot of times in the Bible where people get betrayed at meals. Seems. Perhaps this is, perhaps Jesus knew that Judas was going to betray him at the Last Supper because, he's God and he knows these things. But perhaps he's just such a good student of the Old Testament that he thought to himself, well, if I'm going to be dead on Friday and we're having a big important meal now, surely somebody here is about to betray me. Because if Jesus's life is in some way a recapitulation of the Old Testament. It seems perhaps almost inevitable. But we too hope perhaps to be killed at an important meal, insofar as we hope that God will slay us and make us alive again when we partake of the marriage feast of the Lamb, in his kingdom, which shall have no end. Well, the foretaste thereof. All right, so for the first time in a couple of weeks, I've actually got a second chapter prepared. So, not to be outdone by Nathan, who is an actually good, upstanding character, Joab's going to put on a little bit of an allegorical message of his own, perhaps. Can I get you to read up to verse 3?
Now Joab, the son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart went out to Absalom. And Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman and said to her, pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning garments. Do not anoint yourself with oil, but behave like a woman who has been mourning many days for the dead. Go to the king and speak thus to him. So Joab put the words in her mouth.
All right, so Joab's going to put on a little morality play, perhaps, if you will, for the sake of David. And for the second time in as many chapters, we've got a character that is sort of playing at being God, perhaps. Last chapter, we had Absalom saying, be strong and courageous. And in this chapter, Joab is sending somebody and putting words into their mouth to say to David, like God does to the prophets. All right. Can I get you to read up to verse 11?
11. Okay. When the woman of Tekoa came to the king, she fell on her face to the ground and paid homage and said, Save me, O king. And the king said to her, What is your trouble? She answered, Alas, I am a widow. My husband is dead. And your servant had 2 sons, and they quarreled with one another in the field. There was no one to separate them, and one struck the other and killed him. And now the whole clan has risen against your servant, and they say, Give up the man who struck his brother, that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. And so they would destroy the heir also. Thus they would quench my coal that is left, and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth. Then the king said to the woman, Go to your house, and I will give orders concerning you. And the woman of Tekoa said to the king, On me be the guilt, my lord the king, and on my father's house. Let the king and his throne be guiltless. The king said, If anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he shall never touch you again. Then she said, Please let the king invoke the Lord your God, that the avenger of blood kill no more, and my son be not destroyed. He said, As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground.
So we've got a little performance here in which this woman is supposed to present something that is vaguely similar to David's situation with Absalom. Although it's not exactly similar, there are some key differences. For example, David has loads of other sons. And so, there's not necessarily any reason for him to specifically bring back Absalom, as if, Absalom coming back would be, some sort of preservation of his line and his heritage. So there's that. And the other is, of course, that, this seems like maybe an accident almost. I mean, they're obviously fighting, but at the very least, an unfortunate situation. But David's situation is not unfortunate in the same way. It's a very sort of premeditated. The Avenger of Blood is something that's mentioned in the Torah. It seems to me to be more of a thing that God is sort of legislating around more than legislating into. Like, at no point in the Torah does it seem to me that God says, and you shall have avengers of blood. But there is, this is a purpose of the city of refuge, is that basically, the idea of the avenger of blood seems to be that, if somebody kills somebody else, then basically the avenger of blood is the person who's going to hunt that person down and make sure that they die, presumably by execution. I don't know. And so the purpose of the city of refuge that's mentioned in the Torah is that, you've got these cities where if somebody kills somebody accidentally, they can flee to the city of refuge in order to escape from the avenger of blood. And they must stay there until the death of the high priest, apparently, which is interesting. But that's really all the information that we really get, as far as I'm aware, in the Torah of what the Avenger of Blood is up to. It seems to be one of those many things in the Torah where God is putting laws around something that already exists in the culture rather than instituting something and saying, yes, this is what we need. If somebody accidentally hits somebody else with a car, somebody has to go hunt them down. Like, obviously you need some sort of legal something, otherwise we're living in pure anarchy, but I think this is something particular to that time and place. We also have this interesting phrase that will be repeated at the near the beginning of First Kings. Not one hair shall fall to the ground. The implication of this phrase is pretty straightforward, obviously that you will not be harmed in any way, not even so much as losing a hair, which is the most non-harmful thing that can happen to somebody that might be considered a loss in some way. But it acquires a bit of symbolic meaning for reasons that we're going to find out before this chapter is over, perhaps. But for now, can I get you to continue on to verse 17?
Then the woman said, "Please let your servant speak a word to my lord the king." He said, "Speak." And the woman said, "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again. We must all die. We are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. But God will not take away life, and he devises means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast. Now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid, and your servant thought, I will speak to the king. It may be that the king will perform the request of his servant. For the king will hear and deliver his servant from the hand of the man who would destroy me and my son together from the heritage of God. And your servant thought, the word of my lord the king will set me at rest. For my lord the king is like the angel of God to discern good and evil. The Lord your God be with you.
All right, so there is a certain amount of validity to what she's saying, but it's definitely not straightforwardly accurate. Insofar as, on one hand, it is clear that God, when he establishes the Torah, does care about people's inheritance and their heritage, and wants to ensure that that does not disappear. That is one of the things that comes up in the story of Judah and Tamar in the book of Genesis, is that Tamar was supposed to have a husband and get sons, and Judah never provided this to her. her first husband dies, and then her second husband, who was his brother, was supposed to provide children for the first husband, even though the Lord slew him because he was wicked. And Onan does not do this, and so he also is killed. And then, the rest of that story continues. And then there are also some other things in the Torah where you have these, stipulations for various inheritance-based rules in which the normal customs are sort of bent around in weird ways in order to make sure that they still work out. For example, you have the daughters of Zelophehad. I don't remember exactly how his name is spelled, no less pronounced, but basically you have this one clan leader whose children are all daughters. And so by the normal rules of inheritance, his property would just disappear into other clans and be gone forever, because his property would go to all of his sons-in-law once his daughters get married off, and then his clan would just disappear because none of his sons-in-law would be from his clan. And so there's this special loophole put in place where if you only have daughters, there's I can't explain the exact details, but basically the sons that were going to marry his daughters would end up being in his clan instead of the clans that they were coming from, in order to ensure that his clan would exist. On the other hand, there is no real precedent in the Torah for, if your son deserves the death penalty, but he's your only son, he can be spared. Like, that's not really something that the Torah mentions. And so there is sort of a question of like, what power does she think that David has in this hypothetical situation? Remembering that this is not even a real thing that has happened. This is, in fact, a made-up thing for the sake of a story. But she thinks, I don't know, this is the interesting part. Maybe David does have some amount of authority, maybe not that much authority, but he might have some authority of at least interpreting the Torah, insofar as he is in charge of Israel. We start off with Moses, and Moses has to, he's making all these judgments by himself, and Jethro says, no, you've got to delegate a little bit, or, you'll never be able to help all these people. There's too many of them. And then God gives the Torah, interestingly. Presume it sort of seems as almost like a guide for all the people that Moses is going to delegate to. And then the question is, who has that authority now? And presumably the answer might be David. I mean, he is the king, and so at least from a civil perspective, he might have the authority to do interpretations of the Torah. Whether one of those interpretations can be this man should live and not die is unclear. And this is perhaps what happens when you start wrestling with the serpent instead of saying the Lord rebuke you, is that this woman has been sent by a fairly unsavory character in order to manipulate David into bringing back his son. So perhaps trying to sit here and answer the question of, is he actually allowed to do that, is not the question that we should even be asking.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that I didn't just tie a bunch of weird, confusing knots around us, that we will be able to move forward. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions before we continue?
Nope.
Okay. All right. Can I get you to carry on to verse 20?
Mm-hmm. Then the king answered the woman, "Do not hide from me anything I ask you." And the woman said, "Let my lord the king speak." The king said, "Is the hand of Joab with you in all this?" The woman answered and said, "As surely as you live, my lord the king, one cannot turn to the right hand or to the left from anything that my lord the king has said. It was your servant Joab who commanded me. It was he who put all these words in the mouth of your servant. In order to change the course of things, your servant Joab did this. But my Lord has wisdom like the wisdom of the angel of God to know all things that are on the earth.
All right. So, well, in addition to the deep sorrow and joy that is associated with repentance, David also learned something else in chapter 12, which is how to know if you're in the middle of being hoodwinked or bamboozled,
Mm-hmm.
or perhaps how to apply something to yourself when that is what the person is implying. So David has figured out that perhaps all this is meant to hit a bit closer to home.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Can I get you to read up to verse 27?
Okay. Then the king said to Joab, behold now, I grant this. Go, bring back the young man Absalom. And Joab fell on his face to the ground and paid homage and blessed the king. And Joab said, today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my lord the king, and that the king has granted the request of his servant. So Joab arose and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. And the king said, let him dwell apart in his own house. He is not to come into my presence. So Absalom lived apart in his own house and did not come into the king's presence. Now in all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, for at the end of every year he used to cut it, when it was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head 200 shekels by the king's weight. There were born to Absalom 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. She was a beautiful woman.
All right. So Absalom is brought back to Jerusalem, but he is not brought back into the king's presence. He is not in the court. He is just living in Jerusalem within eyesight, and so you could argue that perhaps this is for the sake of keeping an eye on him. Although that is the question. If you have somebody who has, from one perspective, more right to the throne than anybody else, but from another perspective, maybe you don't want him to become king. Is it better for him to be in a different country, or is it better for him to be in the capital? Hard to. Meanwhile, it appears that some of the hairs of his head are going to hit the ground, insofar as he has a lot of it, just a whole lot of hair, 200 shekels, which I believe is about 6 pounds. Quite the amount of hair. And it appears that he's a little bit vain because, there are very few men who will weigh their hair after it has been cut off of their head. So hopefully his handsome appearance will result in good things, but I'm just gonna say that, well, statistically, it seems unlikely. The last person that we, well, I suppose so far we've heard that Saul was good looking, but we've also heard that David was good looking. So maybe it'll work out one way, maybe another. Then we learn about Absalom's family, perhaps. Well, not perhaps, there it is. He's got 3 sons. Their names are not given, and they don't matter. It's not entirely clear why, though. All we know is that 4 chapters from now, Absalom is going to make a monument to himself because he believes that he has no sons to carry on his inheritance. So what happened to them?
Yeah, that's weird.
I don't know, but we don't know their names. But then he also has a daughter named Tamar, and this is a political ploy. That's what this is. this is a political ploy so that every time they talk about Absalom and his family, they have to remember, oh yeah, remember how Absalom was willing to do something that the king wasn't and punish somebody who did evil in the land of Israel? Remember when he did that? Man, what a stand-up guy.
Mm.
Maybe he should be king.
Mm.
I mean, he is next in line for the throne, aside from Gilead. Gilead who? I don't know. We haven't talked about him for several chapters. Maybe he died young. Maybe he sailed to America. We'll never hear from him again. So this is Absalom's back in Jerusalem, and he's trying to build his base, so to speak. Let's see how this works out for him. Can I get you to read to the end of the chapter?
Mhm. So Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. Then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king. But Joab would not come to him, and he sent a second time, but Joab would not come. Then he said to his servants, see, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab arose and went to Absalom at his house and said to him, why have your servants set my field on fire? Absalom answered Joab, behold, I sent word to you, come here, that I may send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to be there still. Now therefore let me go into the presence of the king, and if there is guilt in me, let him put me to death. Then Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom.
You know what? I think this guy might be a bad guy. So yes, outwardly, it appears that relationships have stabilized, but this is not the case, as we'll see essentially immediately when we come to the next chapter, where the heading for the beginning is labeled Absalom's Conspiracy. So we'll see how that works out next week, or perhaps several months from now. We'll see how that works out.
Do you think you'd be able to do the 2 more weeks?
Yeah, I think so, because I don't actually start until like the 29th, so I think so.
Okay. Well, we're leaving on vacation on the 27th, so yeah, so that would work out. Then the last one would be the 24th.
Okay. So we'll see what becomes of this conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
So for now, though, perhaps we should end this with a prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Lord, help us to seek justice, but not as a ploy for political power, but to seek justice truly, and most especially to seek that righteousness which comes to us through the merits of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm just gonna end the recording now.